filmed on location at our beautiful Old Westbury 604-acre campus. We offer a variety of majors to choose from and a wonderful opportunity to discover the leader in you. Please visit us at oldwestbury.edu.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another program in our series, Living on Long Island. Today we will continue our discussion about public education here on our beautiful island. I am honored to have as my guest Dr. Sean Feeney, principal of the Wheatley School for the past 6 years, and that's in the East Williston School District.
Hi, Joe.
Sean, welcome.
Thank you.
And Peter McNally, Executive Director of the New York State Federation of School Administrators. Peter, nice seeing you again.
Thank you.
On a previous show, we acknowledged that the system here is first rate and that we are fortunate to be part of the Long Island public education system. However, we did look at difficulties in the last program, and we realized that certain things can be corrected or replaced. For example, let's look at the tax cap for a second, which we mentioned last time. I know you're not a government leader, Sean, but what would, in your opinion, be a better idea in terms of helping the schools?
Well, I am a proponent of local control. I do believe that with the correct education, a community can make a good decision, a good vote up or vote down on a budget. I think that in the years leading up to the tax cap, a lot of districts in Long Island effectively had a tax cap around the 4%. As most budgets were below the 4% tax levy rate. So, you know, when you take it out of that local control, you know, you're imposing something externally on districts that, you know, are well aware of what they value in their schools and well aware of the support necessary to keep their schools funded.
Well, again, a taxpayer is going to say, I pay so-and-so thousands of dollars in school taxes. Where is that money going?
Listen, I think a struggle that has happened in this country throughout its existence, especially once the country made a commitment to public education for all, was bottom line, not everybody had students enrolled in public education in schools. If you were a old elderly couple or you were single and you didn't have children, the question was, well, why am I supporting, why is my money being used to support a system that my kids, I don't have kids, aren't part of? Well, that's where our leaders and our political leaders and all of us need to do a better job educating everybody about the benefits of a good, strong, effective public school. This is part of the public trust, and my concern in all these conversations about tax caps and standards and schools and perceived failings, we are eroding the trust that we've had in our public schools. And too many people now perceive them incorrectly in a very holistic way as failures. So this bond is one that has this bond of trust. That is the responsibility, quite frankly, of our elected officials to make sure that people understand the value, because anyone who's looked at the numbers certainly knows that it costs far less to provide a high quality education than it does to keep somebody in a prison, for example, for a year, or to pay unemployment benefits because they can't get a job, or to deal with the societal impact of folks who are not educated and are not feeling part of our society. Our public schools have been a crucial vehicle and mechanism to the success we've had as a country.
Okay. You have anything to add?
Just to answer your question, Joe, part of what we have to do is look at central administration and see what costs can be cut there so that the funds are more directly provided to the schools. When the governor proposed the tax cap, he also proposed consolidation of school districts. Now that is not well received on Long Island. But recently, the School Boards Association did put out a recommendation, especially for some of the upstate school districts, that might be a solution because as we mentioned in the earlier segment, we know that our colleagues upstate are having much more of a difficult time providing the necessary instruction to the students. So they have to look at much more cost cutting at an administrative level so that the children get what they need.
About public education, I'm a product of it, not only elementary school, high school. I went to the Brooklyn College City University. I now teach at Westbury here, which is a state university. You said it well. I mean, it's penny wise and pound foolish to cut money for education. You're going to spend it many times over later.
One of the struggles that a lot of our school districts have right now is, maintaining the costs connected to the pensions. School employees are fortunate in that there's still pensions available for these employees, and certainly that should be maintained. That's a commitment that drew some folks to the profession and has kept others in the profession. But even though there's been some reform over the last few years, they've added different tiers. They've added a tier 4, a 5, and then a tier 6. Bottom line, some of our struggles are the result of deals that politicians made back in the 90s regarding the number of contributions, the amount of contributions, the years for which people in tier 4 needed to contribute. And had those deals not been made, whereas they said after 10 years, and this was a deal made the highest levels of our government, they changed the pension requirements, so those in tier 4, after 10 years, they didn't have to contribute anymore. What kind of a system does one put in place whereas people who are working only have to contribute for 10 years into a system that will then pay them into retirement well beyond? That was a politically motivated decision. Clearly there was no mathematician in the room when that decision was made, because anyone with any basic level of mathematical understanding would have recognized that that's not sustainable. And these costs are enormous costs for districts, and had that decision not been made, we wouldn't be talking about as much. The impact would not be as great in terms of the funding requirements for schools, because a huge driver of school budgets is related to, yes, salaries, but also pension costs, healthcare costs, a lot of these external costs. So what's happening now is the portion of the budget over which one really can have some control, is really no more than 20-25%.
Yes, you had something to add to that?
No, I agree with Sean that the pension system is something that's very important and valuable to our employees, and it should be continued. But it is time for it to be looked at carefully, as Sean gave some examples. The other thing that has to be taken into consideration is that due to the longevity of our retired educators, that is something that was not necessarily taken into consideration years ago.
Sure.
Fortunately now, we do have a much longer longevity, and that is more of a strain. But it just is a mathematical calculation that needs to be adjusted. Controller DiNapoli has informed us that the pension funds are doing much better now because the economy is. So we just have to look at all the variables.
But isn't that throughout our history, not to go on with it, but when economic times are tough, when money is tight and things, people look for these things too.
Well, we're still coming out of one of the greatest economic crises of our time, certainly many people's lives. And there were people who were angry because they felt that teachers during these horrible economic times, because of the contracts that were in place, some teachers still got their raises in many districts. Now other teachers forego raises and so on and so forth, but raises continued and pensions were still secure, and I think there was a lot of anger and resentment.
Well, in the city, for years I gave up raises we put into our pensions. When private people were making $300,000, they weren't complaining. Now all of a sudden, so
$300,000 is chump change for a lot of the money that's being made these days.
Exactly. Okay. Let's get to the educational part now. The Common Core curriculum, New York State assessment tests, teacher and principal evaluations. We agreed on a previous show that we need some amount of accountability, testing, student achievement, yes. On those two things I just mentioned, what could be done that would make it better? That would be fairer, that would be less stressful, and would measure things in a better way?
There's a tremendous over-reliance on tests right now in
Could you explain what level?
At all levels. We are testing third graders.
Third through 12th now.
Well, New York State has mandated testing for grades 3 through 8. These are the
Okay.
New York State
Right.
tests
Okay.
that were put into place really under No Child Left Behind.
Okay.
But since then, we've seen a dramatic expansion of the testing program. So we test in the spring all of our 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders. This past year, those older grades saw 9 hours total, minimum, of testing in mathematics and English over a 2-week period. So they go in on 3 consecutive days in each of those subjects and they get tested. Now, if you are a child with special needs, those 9 hours may very well become 12 or even 18 hours with your testing accommodations. And you know, do we really need 9 hours of testing to see if our youngest students understand mathematics and language? You know, you compare that to, you know, 3.5 hours of testing for AP exams for kids in 10th, 11th, 12th grade. The MCATs, you know, 4.5 hours of testing. LSATs, you know, 3.5 hours of testing.
But
it's outrageous.
Sean, you're only talking about the hours for the high stakes testing.
Correct.
Many of our school districts have interim assessment tests that go on almost on a monthly basis. So you add all those hours together, and that it's much more of a dedication towards assessment than instruction, and that's where we would like to see the pendulum go back.
So what would be your ideas? What alternatives do you have for this?
An over-reliance on high-stakes tests?
Yeah. Now, what would be your time frame? What would be your grade? What, you know, how would you run it differently?
You don't need this much testing.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Teachers, these tests are given to kids. They are not released to teachers. Teachers had to sign off on a memo saying that if you reveal the contents, you risk losing your job. So these tests are all secret. Now, the state released selective questions, but that doesn't give anyone a broad understanding of what's on the test. So teachers don't have a good understanding of what the kids are being assessed as we're implementing, how these children are being assessed, even as we're implementing this brand new curriculum. So you've got to bring teachers into the loop and let them use tests, whatever are given, as tools, learning tools. Here's the assessment, here's how Johnny did, here's how Bobby Sue did. Now, what can we do better? And that's not being permitted because the state has really put you know, the fear of losing one's job into the teachers and really created this environment you know, with their security enhancements and protocols and telling the public they're really serious about making sure there's no cheating. Well, you know what? By saying that, they're creating the environment, whereas a level of distrust among the public and educators, well, that's what they do. They cheat on tests. And clearly, we've seen huge cheating scandals across this country because the system incentivizes such behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that it's inevitable, but when you create a system where your salary, your job, pay raises, rely or are dependent on how well kids bubble in some sheets, inevitably, that's a system that incentivizes behavior that is abhorrent to the vast majority of educators.
And this causes an unwritten byproduct is it causes increased tension and it causes anxiety for
Very much.
teachers, parents, and students alike.
Correct.
For
Absolutely.
for what purpose?
Correct. Yeah, it
So
does.
if a child supposedly fails these tests, or teachers' children fail a test. The principal's students fails these tests. What happens to these people? What happens to the kids? What happens to the teachers? What happens to the principal? Are they looked upon differently? Is a punitive action? What happens?
According to the regulations the state has put in place, teachers, according to this APPR legislation, 2 consecutive years of being an ineffective teacher will cost you your job.
So that alone makes you an ineffective teacher.
It's a little more complicated than that, Joe, but yes, the scores are critical. The state will say, well, no, we're looking at multiple measures like all good systems, but there's really an override, whereas if for the state-provided growth score as well as that local score measure, if you're not effective in those, you don't stand a chance. And that's the way these have been set up.
Because as Sean said, it's a very complicated system. You're graded on 100 points. 40% of those points are on student achievement. So that is why it is very heavily handed, that if you have a difficult or challenging assignment, that it's very hard to demonstrate the growth of those students, that it can come back to harm your evaluation or your rating. And as Sean said, that for a teacher, it's called the HEIDI system, highly effective, effective, developing, or ineffective. For ineffective or developing teachers, a teacher improvement plan has to be put in place to work on that teacher, to help that teacher develop, whether or not that teacher might have actually needed the additional help or not, or whether it was their assignment that was the factor. So there is a lot of consequences that have to be put into place immediately, which is additional burdens and responsibilities and distractions for school leaders. They might not have been their priorities.
But more importantly, we have to stand up and question the validity of this entire system. There's no research to support the tying of student test scores to educator effectiveness, period.
So why did they do this?
Because it sounds like it makes sense. Okay. Joe, listen, I am a principal of a building 8 through 12. As such, I received 2 scores from the state. I received a score, 9 through 12 score. I received an 8th grade score. So the state gave me 2 scores. One of my scores, I was effective, my 9 through 12. My 8th grade score, I was a developing principal. Now my 8th grade, and that's based on the results of my 8th graders. Now my 8th graders, we accelerate all of our kids. So our 8th graders, yes, they take the Math 8 assessment, that state assessment in 8th grade, but they also take the more rigorous and challenging algebra regents. So how many of our 8th graders took that algebra regents? 91% of them. Of those 8th graders that took the algebra regents, what percentage passed? 99% of them. Yet, those same 8th graders, we only had a 39% pass rate on the Math 8 exam, which is supposedly easier. We had students who failed, level 1, level 2, failed the Math 8 exam, who then scored at the high benchmark level on the harder Algebra 1 regents. Tremendous inconsistency. There's no stability of the scores, and the state has such confidence that, this is how we can measure teachers. Not at all. I have a teacher who is rated highly effective by the state on all this system, who I rate as someone that needs to be on a development plan. And that's what's happening.
All right. I tell you another byproduct of this, and I wish the public understands this and the media understands this, a byproduct of this, and you may not see it for a while, why would at a time when we really need them, why would anyone go into this profession now with all this tension, anxiety, and everybody looking at them? It's going to drive people away, and that's what we don't need.
There were headlines on this a little bit ago. What's happening is we're getting a lot of folks who are driven to the excitement of teaching for a few years at a very young age, maybe in a charter school, and then quickly moving on either to their business careers or maybe at times, being a school leader after a few years in the classroom.
Let's finish this with testing. Let's just take one grade, let's say a 7th grade right now. What would be what should be the testing procedure for an average 7th grader? And if the child doesn't pass it, what then should happen? What kind of help could he or she then get?
Okay. Well, Joe, going back to what Sean said earlier, first we have to look at the high stakes testing and look to see if the instrument, the test that's actually be given on the 7th grade is appropriate, meaning the level of difficulty, the amount of time that a student has to sit
So
to take
who
those.
looks at that?
The state education department should be looking at that, and it should be doing having outside testing evaluators looking at to see if that is an appropriate document, and correlating the scores and results as well. That, you know, we know that it's not an exact science as such, and that especially since these are new exams, they have to be evaluated to see if they are the most appropriate.
And
Because
experienced
as Sean-
teachers and principals should be involved in this
Educators, yes, as both those that are vested in the system and those that from outside the system that have the training. Because as Sean said, you know, the example in his school is so dramatic that students that are doing well on an algebra exam are not doing well on a math exam for the same grade level, shows that there is a discrepancy there that has to be looked at. Because our state Board of Regents tells us that one of the indicators for college readiness is a good performance on an algebra test. So if Sean's students are college ready on one test, but ineffective on another, it's...
Well, more importantly, you know, in terms of what our school produces at the end of a student's career, we had last year the highest advanced regents designation in all schools in Long Island, well above the state average of roughly 43-46%. Ours was 89%. We had a 100% graduation rate with 100% students getting regents diploma, far above anything that happens statewide. And I've got the state telling me that, you know what, you're really only a developing principal, and your kids, only 39% of your 8th graders are going to be college and career ready. Well, you know what? 100% of our kids get into college, and over 92% of them go to 4-year colleges. We track these students, we do surveys, and they do well, and they're prepared for college.
But that's not mentioned in any of these.
Of course it's not.
No.
By most national rankings, our school is well in the top 1% of all schools nationwide, all high schools nationwide. So their metrics are wrong, and this belief in metrics that they've got the formula is seriously misguided, and it is having a dramatic and dangerous impact on our schools.
We only have a few minutes left, but I just want to touch on one other subject, then we'll get to one more, about the teacher-principal evaluations. There's a term, a letter term.
APPR.
Thank you. That's why you're the expert and I'm not. What is a substitute for that? Is that actually needed? In other words, they publish teachers' effectiveness?
Effectively, yeah, they will. Teachers have always been evaluated. Some districts have struggled with it, but those districts that have successful schools, you know what, they evaluate teachers real well. It's no coincidence. And our state education officials made changes back in 2010 in a desire to get Race to the Top money to change the way in which we evaluate teachers and to tie teacher effectiveness to student learning. Now, to student test scores, not to student learning, sorry, to student test scores. That was a big change because there used to be a law in the books that said you weren't allowed to do to tie that, so they changed it. So the APPR has created is a tremendously cumbersome process that is not going to produce and has not produced the results that had been envisioned or promised.
So leave the evaluations with the principals then?
Correct.
Thank you.
And the evaluation of principals to superintendents, holding them accountable to make sure that the work is done.
Sounds good to me.
Right. And Joe, if I could just go back
Sure.
to one thing that you had mentioned before that Sean mentioned earlier. One of the biggest solutions to all of the issues that we have raised is much more of a commitment to ongoing professional development. And that can be a state education directive, allowing school principals to change the school schedule to devote more time. As Sean mentioned earlier, many of our colleagues consider this like an airplane that's being built. If more time was given to school leaders to work on the plane before it takes off, to make sure that the staff is comfortable with the standards, to make sure that the staff knows what the assessments will look like, then the staff can do a better job starting tomorrow. Not too late, giving us a professional development day next June is not going to help the faculty address the needs of the children now. But we don't have that ability to make those kind of changes. That's where state ed could step up and say, yes, we do see a need for all these things, we do have to correct some things, but the very first thing we have to do is make sure everybody's on the same page and well prepared. And we don't have that necessity to do that with our staff the way it should be done.
There are children in Long Island who come from families with low income, difficult family situations. Some go to bed hungry. The school can't solve the poverty problem in America. That's a nation. We haven't solved it. What could schools do? What could a school system do to try to overcome that gap between the students who have so much at home and some who have so little?
That, this notion of poverty is a crucial one, and many folks don't want to talk about poverty, but ultimately, fairly or unfairly, whether people like it or not, that is one of the most significant factors impacting student achievement. When you look at our international test scores, and really we've always been in the middle, but you know what, we're in the middle because we are number one for child poverty among most countries. On average, over 20%, over 21% child poverty. That is an astronomical number. Now, if you break up a little bit and just focus in on the districts that have comparable poverty levels to, say, those countries such as Finland or Canada that do really well, the U.S. outperforms them. When you just take a look at those districts with less than 10% poverty, our kids outperform all others on these state benchmarks, the PISA test, whatever it might be. Poverty matters, and if we could provide services whereas kids had health care, families had daycare, children had meals, a safe place to be and to study and work, and all of the things that we know and research knows help support student achievement, they'd make a huge impact. They talk about teachers being the most important factor. Yes, they're the most important factor within a school, but they really impact only 10 to 15% of overall student achievement. And we can't forget that. Well, what's the other 85, 90%? It's all those other factors that we need to address as a nation.
On a state level, the governor has an initiative called Community Schools, and it is exactly what Sean is talking about, bringing in the other services, whether it be the food and nutrition or the health or recreation, to help the child go beyond the school day. But I can speak for New York City. I think we're going to have 11 community schools next year out of 1,700. Okay, we have a long way to go to develop these kind of collaborations and these wraparound programs. But it is something that, as a nation, as a state, we need to address much more rigorously.
That's all the time we have for now. I know that these programs have made a positive contribution to the public education dialogue. That's what we're looking for. Reality, honesty, not headlines, but we're looking to make a contribution that will help our children. Again, I want to thank my guests, Dr. Sean Feeney.
Thank you, Joe.
And Mr. Peter McNally
Thank
for
you.
their invaluable contributions to the discussion. May the leaders and decision makers listen to their ideas and suggestions. Maybe it will help. Also, I want to express my appreciation to SUNY at Westbury for the use of their fine studio, to Sherry Baker, the student manager, and her terrific crew. Until next time, this is Joe Haynor wishing you a good night and a better tomorrow.